Investors are usually pretty savvy, though, when it comes to this kind of thing, and don't tend to necessarily follow the headlines.
Well, that's not true.
No?
This is the majority, the institutional investors, which are the big players. They're the ones who tend to control these markets. But the average person who has money in their RSPs, or maybe they play the stock market, they're the people who tend to lose, and that's a well-known track record. And in terms of the stock markets, if you're a big player, you only need about $1 billion to affect what is happening on a given stock market because of the way that the computerized systems work.
Is that what we saw here in North America last week?
Well, absolutely. This rubbish about a fat finger accidentally making a mistake, it doesn't work that way. What we saw was liquidations of certain assets out there which created an automatic response from the computer robots that then push the prices down because they react. And what the big institutional players, they make money off the transactions. They're actually not investing in the interests of their client base. And what we find is when we look at actual volume levels on the markets, the volumes aren't that great for the amount of business that's actually being done. So there are some inherent problems with the system. And frankly, many of the so-called investment experts and market players, they themselves do not fully understand what is going on simply because it's an automated process.
So what does the situation in Greece say to us? Does it put Canadian markets at risk? Does it make the Canadian government fragile in any way?
Well, absolutely, because all currencies on the planet Earth right now are fiat currencies, and I have to explain what that means. At the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed because most countries were essentially bankrupt because of the war, making the United States the global reserve currency, which is backed by sovereign gold reserves from these various countries plus the U.S. However, in 1971, Richard Nixon reneged on Bretton Woods and delinked the U.S. dollar from gold because effectively the U.S. was bankrupt at that time. The cost of the Vietnam War, the space program, and the social programs in the United States had brought the U.S. to the brink. And the only way the U.S. could get out of this debt situation was to print money. But they couldn't because they were limited by the gold standard. So at that point, after 1971, what we saw was all global currencies became fiat. And what I mean by fiat is they're not backed by anything, by gold or silver. So the result is if you look at printing of money in the United States from 1971 on, it's literally a hockey stick compared to 1776 up to 1971. And of course, we saw the trillions of dollars printed by the Obama administration when they came into power. So what we have is a hyperinflation model, and the paper money essentially becomes worthless. And this is really what we're seeing in these bonds that are being issued today to supposedly cover the debts of Greece, is debt being laid upon debt, but not actually backed by anything. And the problem is that's fundamentally a Ponzi system, and it will collapse. It is inevitable. So it will affect Canada because the Canadian dollar is ultimately also a fiat currency.
And yet when you have the difficulty that we saw in Greece, the short-term impact seemed to be that people sought safe haven in the United States, and suddenly the Canadian dollar went down.
Well, this is true, and here's one of the reactions. The United States has been creating a series of economic bubbles. If you look at U.S. Financial history from the creation of the Federal Reserve on, so from 1913 on, you see a series of artificial economic bubbles that are created, but we've had a lot since about 1999. We've had, and the key ones were, of course, the dot-com bubble, then we had the housing bubble, then we had the TARP bubble, then we've now seeing call it the euro deflation bubble. It's not that the US dollar is going up. what is happening is the euro is falling faster than the US dollar. So the way it's presented is that the dollar is stronger, which it technically is. But here's the killer. Let's not forget the eighth largest economy in the world was California. California's economy is bigger than the pigs put together. And the Californian system is essentially bankrupt. We're now sitting at 50 U.S. states are at the edge of bankruptcy or are effectively bankrupt. So putting your money into the United States dollar or into the U.S. for any reason, it's kind of like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. And people don't seem to understand these most economic or fundamentals of economics in this sort of area. And this is where, from a security perspective, of course, we're looking at what happens when the systems break down. And all of a sudden, food is not being transported. People can't take money out of banks. And we've seen this in the United States before in, the great crash that led to the dirty 30s.
Do you think we're facing something similar to that in the future?
In the immediate future, and it's not just my opinion. I'm certainly not an economist. I see this from the perception of someone in the security world and sort of chaos around the world. This has now been predicted for years, and all that has happened is the U.S. has periodically reinflated the bubble. And what happens is, each time this has happened, it just simply makes the end result worse. We are seeing a systemic collapse of the Anglo-American banking system that has dominated certainly the Western world and the rest of the planet for the last, let's arguably say, 300 years. So we are in for a major social paradigm shift, and the majority of people are simply being misinformed.
And we in Canada seem to think that we're insulated in some way because we have, by comparison, a stronger, supposedly safer banking system than either the United States or Britain or certainly Greece.
Well, we certainly do if you're comparing banking systems to banking systems. It's another issue if you are basing it on the fact that it's a fiat currency. Canada's saving grace, however, which the United States doesn't have, is that the Chinese invested heavily in this country, and our commodities and our food production capacity is going to mitigate to some degree what will happen in the Western world. And when I say Western, we're talking the Western industrialized world. It's going to be affected by this. And, these are not pie-in-the-sky analysis. The CIA last year in a Los Angeles Times article, was talking about the potentials of civil war in the United States when the economic collapse comes. Not if it comes, when it comes. So there's a lot of evidence out there that the system can no longer sustain itself because essentially it's a house of cards built on debt. And, you have to bring this down to the individual level. Most people in North America, certainly in the United States and Canada, really don't own what they think they own. They have mortgages, they have loans, and they have credit. So the result is that there isn't a basis for a sustained economic recovery just based on that debt factor alone. But now when a government does it, i.e. a government bond, it issues a promissory note that is going to pay you so much money in the future if you lend them so much money. What ends up happening is those bonds keep growing, and this is what we've seen in the case of pretty much every Western industrialized state.